All right, friends, welcome to another edition of Justice Matters One-on-One. I am thrilled today to have somebody I think I'm entitled to call a friend now, Miles Taylor. And, you may know Miles Taylor through some of what the Trump administration has tried to do to both he and Chris Krebs. And I don't want to jump to the end of the story. I want to start at the beginning of the story. So Miles worked for the Trump administration. He was chief of staff at DHS. And you may remember that based on some of what he saw inside the Trump administration, he decided to do something about it. And I'll ask him whether this was an easy or a very difficult decision. I suspect I know the answer, but based on what he was seeing, he penned an anonymous op-ed talking about some of what he was seeing on the inside and actually went on to write a book, a warning, and it was by anonymous. At first, he did not use his name. And to say that there has been some fallout as a result of that with Donald Trump on his revenge tour is probably a gross understatement. But let me start by welcoming Miles Taylor to Justice Matters One-on-One.
Hey, Glenn,
great to have you here, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let me take the interviewer's prerogative for a minute, because the first time I ever met Miles in person was actually in recent weeks at Jim Acosta's live event in downtown D.C. Now, we had been on MSNBC together, air quotes, any number of times, but we were in boxes being beamed in from separate locations. Yeah. So it's funny, I felt like I knew you from our joint appearances over the years on MSNBC, but I was really happy to finally get to meet you. And then, Miles, when I saw the comments you made at Jim Acosta's live show to the audience, and I don't say this to blow smoke, I was inspired because I know a little bit of what you have gone through and what you are going through as a result of being obviously, maybe one of the marquee members on Donald Trump's enemies list, but the approach that you're taking to it and, how you've decided to respond to these horrific circumstances inspired me when I heard you tell the story. So I'm really glad you took the time to come on down to Leesburg to my studio and be here for a live interview.
It's great to be here. And I'll just say, sometimes in those boxes on TV, you can form a closer friendship than some of the folks when you go through turmoil like this, you thought maybe we're friends. And, that's a realization that I've come to is, sometimes folks I've never met, I found out that I'm closer to and more aligned with than people who've been on the journey until the journey got difficult.
Yeah, I feel the same way. So here's what I'm going to do. Maybe this is unfair. I'm going to ask you to do some of the heavy lifting in this interview, because what I'd like you to do is kind of take our viewers through the arc of what you have experienced, starting with your government service, which was even before Donald Trump. So you can talk a little bit about your backstory, where you come from. You served, I believe, in the George W. Bush administration as well. But then I would like you to focus on your time in the Trump administration, what led you to kind of pen the anonymous op-ed and then author the book. And then kind of we're going to move forward to what you're going through right now as a result of, and I don't want to bury the lead, Donald Trump issuing an executive order demanding that you be criminally investigated, where from this old prosecutor's perspective, I don't think there's any evidence that you committed any crime. So to say this is a gross abuse of presidential power is an understatement. So with all of that, maybe you can start at the beginning, where'd you come from, and then talk about your time with the Trump administration.
Well, start from the beginning. I grew up in a small town in Indiana, a town called LaPorte, and kind of wound up in Washington through sort of fortuitous circumstances. First job in high school, like a lot of kids, was working at a restaurant. Really, it was a catering company, and I was working as a dishwasher. And I hated it because I would come home every night and my hands were scalded from the dishwashing. So my dad said, if you want to use your head and not your hands, you got to go find the job. And I stumbled into a local radio station with a resume, and at that point, your resume is, like the top line on a piece of paper. I washed dishes and I am in high school. And it just so happened that day, they were having a lot of frustration in the news department at the radio station. And they hired me on the spot as a, minimum wage intern. Fast forward, I got thrust into these circumstances where anytime a major political figure was coming through Northwest Indiana, here I was, this little cub reporter intern at the radio station. I would get sent to go cover it as part of the press pool. So that included when, the president came to town, and I could go be a part of the press pool with my little badge. And so in one of these visits, a U.S. Senator Evan Bayh at the time was doing a speech up in the region. And I went, and afterwards I'm interviewing him, and he tells me to stop the tape, and he says, "What are you doing? How old are you?" And I tell him, "I'm 15, sir." And he says, "Have you ever considered coming out to Washington as a congressional page?" And turns out there's this program that's existed for 200 years since the Continental Congress to bring young students out to Washington for between 6 months and a year to work on the ground floor of democracy, to work in Congress.
Now, this sounds like a Hollywood script, right? Where all of a sudden you're invited to come out to Washington.
And to me, a lot better than washing dishes, especially because the owner of that catering company would just chain smoke cigars right over my shoulder. And so I got to go out to D.C. And this is in the immediate wake of 9/11. And so I'm just a kid in Washington, very affected by 9/11. But then there, kind of watching, what I hope isn't the last time in modern American history, leaders really literally work across the aisle. And pages sit there in the very back of the chamber at this desk, this perch with this extraordinary view of the House chamber and the Senate pages in the Senate chamber. And so that was my introduction to Washington, and it kicked off a series of jobs in D.C. I basically stayed out there. I worked in Dennis Hastert's office when he was Speaker of the House, and then took a temporary role at the Pentagon, and from the Pentagon went to Dick Cheney's office at the White House when he was Vice President, and then I squeezed in a little bit of college there, but dropped out of college for a period of time because there was an opportunity to work in the administration. So I took a presidential appointment at DHS, the department created to stop another 9/11. And to me, I couldn't have asked for anything better. I wanted to be in government to prevent a day like that from happening again. And basically, as a young guy, had this early opportunity to do that. And then stayed in D.C., worked on Capitol Hill, worked my way up when John Boehner was Speaker of the House, and then Paul Ryan working in positions in Republican leadership, on committees. And then Donald Trump announces that he's running for the presidency. And a lot of us that were working, then Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, a lot of us helping shape Paul Ryan's policy agenda, and I helped write his national security strategy at the time. We're very dubious about the notion that Donald Trump was going to win, like a lot of folks in the party. He got the nomination, but, many of us were, we'd be down on the House floor during votes talking to Republican members of Congress and saying, look, you need to rescind your endorsement. This guy's going to lose. He's going to lose badly. He's going to be the darkest stain on the Republican Party. And you're going to want to say you stood on the right side of history.
Well, how prophetic that
turns out that they were right and I was wrong. That, if they wanted to ingratiate themselves with him, they had made the right bet. And of course he wins. A lot of big things happened in my life after that. But that was my journey into D.C.
Wow. And you said something that made me nostalgic. You said that when leaders worked across the aisle, and maybe we'll circle back to that a little bit later, because I do think, we continue to look to the Republican Party and members of Congress, hoping that someday they will cross the aisle to save democracy as things get worse and worse and really devolve, courtesy of Donald Trump's abuse and overreach and lawlessness, according to federal court rulings. Now, talk a little bit about what you did in the Trump administration, what you saw, and what it prompted you to do.
Yeah, look, I'm a lifelong conservative. I consider myself vastly more conservative than Donald Trump is. I'm an ideological conservative in the truest sense, a Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, classical liberal or libertarian, right? For the academics out there, that's my worldview. And I just did not see him as a conservative and not as a Republican. He was kind of a party switching guy, bouncing back and forth, unmoored to any discernible principles. But I was also very worried after he won, like a lot of people, that this untested man of no clear ideological origin was going to come into the executive branch of the most powerful country in the world and, wreak havoc with his inexperience. At the outset, though, I didn't want to be a part of that in any way, shape, or form. I considered both professionally and personally, the safer place to be is just to be on Capitol Hill and Paul Ryan's house. And he was that type of Republican that I always wanted to be. And someone that I looked up to, I wouldn't say a close mentor because he hadn't been a mentor up until that point, but was John Kelly, 4-star Marine general from U.S. Southern Command. He didn't know Donald Trump, from Tom Cruise. They'd not ever met in person, but he got picked to be Secretary of Homeland Security. And, I'd known him as a person of great integrity when he'd come up and testify on Capitol Hill. And he goes into the administration, and over the course of several months was interacting with him and his incoming team at DHS. And his sales pitch to come in to join him was effectively, hey, it's not as bad as it looks inside the Trump administration. It is so much worse. But I think he understood the audience he was talking to and the handful of us he was trying to recruit to be on the team, which is to say, you think it looks bad on TV? It's a shit show over here. And they could be turning this department into a, army of 250,000 personal servants to Donald Trump. I need people who come in who know national security and can help steer the ship. And so, I thought long and hard about it and eventually decided to take a job on John Kelly's team. And fast forward, eventually became the chief of staff over at the Department of Homeland Security, where I thought, Glenn, I was going to spend hopefully most of my time focused on those 250,000 people responsible for protecting 300 million plus Americans. And it turned out over the course of those 2 years, the vast majority of my time was spent focused on one person, because one person, the President of the United States, was with great regularity trying to abuse the powers of the department for his personal gain or to do things that were immoral or unethical or sometimes unconstitutional. It's not a character to say that we were scrambling on a daily basis to stop those things. And I say scrambling because you'd wake up in the morning, you'd see the tweet, you'd have a full normal agenda in Washington. If you're working for a cabinet secretary, your agenda is morning intelligence briefing and meeting with the Secret Service and then flying to this place to look into a national security issue, and a very disciplined agenda that the American people would expect you to be focused on. Instead, you saw that tweet and you would text the secretary and say, we have to cancel your whole day because we need to rush to the White House, tell the president this thing is crazy. We need to stop this from getting out into the public. He wants to pull out of NATO, or he wants to shoot pregnant women at the border, or whatever it is. And our life was just consumed by these convulsions out of the Oval Office, which is not what you want the people running Homeland Security to be doing on a daily basis.
It feels like you were tasked with, dealing with a toddler with a gun. It's so infuriating from somebody who spent 30 years as a public servant, not having to contend with that. We were just doing the hard work of the American people at the Department of Justice, representing them hopefully well and honestly and honorably. And it's literally impossible for me to envision being injected into government and having this be my daily work.
Yeah. Well, there was also, look, I will say I've had a lot of years to be self-reflective about this. There was an extraordinary naivete, perhaps even hubris on the part of a lot of us who went in with this notion that we were going to be what I called the steady state, not a deep state, right? And Donald Trump has painted this picture of a nefarious cabal of people coordinating to thwart the lawful orders of a commander-in-chief. Much more accurately, what you have is just you had a lot of honorable public servants who wanted to make sure that the big boss didn't do things that were illegal. That's it. And that's what you would expect out of your public servants is, hey, let's make sure the president doesn't do things that break the law. And
so when we hear terms like guardrails, I'm going to stay inside government and I'm going to be a guardrail. Is that kind of an accurate reflection of what y'all were trying to do?
And the reason, well, I'll jump back in time. So I have either I have the dubious distinction of being one of the people to coin the term axis of adults, as there was a group of us early in the administration, and there was a particular reporter that I had met at an event at the time, and I'd said, I would agree with the sketch that there is an axis of adults here in this administration, and that reporter went and ran that as a headline, and there was a number of us kind of using that term quietly in the time period to suggest that Donald Trump had intentionally or unintentionally picked a pretty strong cabinet in the sense that they were averse to his amorality and very keen to make sure they spoke truth to power. I thought that was a very good thing, but I was deluded in thinking that the administration could remain stable, that there could be this steady state all the way to the end of 4 years, and that those people could talk good sense into Donald Trump with regularity. The first year, that thesis loosely held. I mean, there were a lot of bad things that happened and got past the goalie, if you will, but a lot that didn't, and a lot of really reckless things that got put back in the box, and the American people didn't have to worry about them. That started to change in year 2. And that's why I say it was sort of hubris to think that that was going to work, that a group of unelected bureaucrats like us were somehow going to keep Donald Trump from being Donald Trump, who he wanted to be. And in that second year, a lot of those decisions we were worried about started to come to fruition. Things like family separation, which Donald Trump had actually wanted to do from the very, very first months of the administration as a punitive measure to deter people from coming to the U.S. border, take the kid away from the parent, and use that as a deterrent mechanism. Those things started to get past the goalie, and Trump pushed them through over the objections of a lot of different folks. That's when it was really dawning on me that whatever axis of adults there wasn't able to have an influence on him anymore. And what's more, those same adults were worried that he was, at best, unfit for office, and at worst, in the words of one of them, a danger to the fabric of our republic. So imagine being a youngling presidential appointee under these cabinet secretaries, these graybeards, and one of them, says to you after a meeting in the White House Situation Room, I think the man is a danger to the fabric of our republic. That's a pretty goddamn alarming. And I grew frustrated in that second year that some of those folks held opinions that were that stark about the commander-in-chief, but weren't sharing them with the people who actually hire that person, as voters. And so I made a decision at one point to go out there and tell people that that was the case inside the administration. First in that summer of 2018, my bigger concern, I had no even sense that I might try to go communicate to the outside world about how bad things were inside the administration, because there were active conversations among cabinet secretaries at the time about a number of them resigning in protest, and perhaps even coordinating those resignations around the time of the midterm elections, ahead of the midterm elections, to draw attention to the turbulence inside the administration. Well, I don't need to tell anyone that never happened. This idea of a sort of midnight self-massacre of a bunch of the cabinet members doing a walkout didn't materialize. And there wasn't some grand moment where they decided we're not going to do it or we are going to do it. Just kind of one by one, cabinet members thought, well, maybe now is not the right time ahead of the midterms. We will get blamed for losses if the president loses in the House. Let's wait till after and see what happens. I was very frustrated by that because there was extraordinary concern about the president's fitness for office, that even some cabinet members had talked about, hey, we may be put in a position where we need to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove the president. I mean, that's extraordinary. Now, whether you agree with it, if that was acceptable or not, that is something that didn't belong, I thought, in private smoke-filled rooms. People needed to know it was getting that bad. And so there was a precipitating event for me, is as I'm getting disappointed that it seems like these folks aren't going to go out there and talk about what's happening inside the administration. A mentor of mine, John McCain, passed away. Someone I'd looked up to. He was actually the first member of Congress I ever met when I came into Washington. As a young page on the House floor, McCain was giving a tour, and he came over to the House side, and I met him in the hallway. I was just awed. He was the type of Republican I wanted to be and that I looked up to. Passed away of brain cancer. And I'm on the way to the other side of the world, to Australia, when I get the news. And I'm meeting with the Five Eyes intelligence community, our closest intelligence partners, talking about national security threats. And I go back to the hotel that night. I'm asleep. It's around 3 a.m. in Australia. And I get a phone call from the White House. And it's John Kelly's office. And I'm told that the president wants to order us at DHS to have the flags on every federal building across the United States raised from half staff, where they were, in honor of a recently deceased U.S. senator, all the way back up. Why? Because he hated John McCain. Because John McCain so often challenged Donald Trump. He was a service member opposing a guy who tried to dodge, military service. And that phone call, there were a lot of reasons to get pissed off inside the Trump administration, probably a lot better reasons. But for me personally, it was like watching a bad man stomp on the recently dug grave of a good one. And of course, we ended up, not ordering the flags to go back up in an active act of dishonor of a man who just passed away. So that didn't happen. But I got up in the middle of the night in that hotel room and I opened my iPad and I just started writing. And I wrote what at the time was a journal entry just to myself about how egregious that decision was, but also how it reflected this broader chaos under the surface of the administration, what it meant for the country. And as I'm writing this, I thought, how stupid is this? That I'm writing this for myself. For what? For posterity. What fucking good does that do to the country if I'm just writing this for me? People should hear this. And before I could talk myself out of it, I flipped those raw notes to a friend who I said, hey, could you put me in touch with someone over at the New York Times? I want to talk to them about writing a piece along these lines. And they did. And I ended up publishing that piece after a few days. And I decided to publish it anonymously, not under my own name. Why? The easy response that people will say is, you coward, you were scared to put this in your own name. They might be surprised to know it was more crass than that. And it was, I knew it would get attention. And I thought this deserved attention more than any other issue people were talking about in the United States. And if
let me interrupt you. What was the calculation? So you had a couple of different options, a few different options, right? You could have resigned. You could have resigned and gone public and said, this is what's been going on inside the administration. You could have leaked rather than doing it in an anonymous column. I mean, listen, the government's full of leakers, right? Or you could have chosen to do what you did. I'm just curious, why did you settle on that rather than resigning and speaking out?
Yeah. First, on resigning and speaking out under my own name, I'd always intended, yes, I have to do that. And, I ended up quitting the administration and coming forward in my own name. But we'd already seen that with people. We were a year and a half into the Trump administration at that point. The people who resigned and went and talked to reporters about, hey, it's kind of dicey in there. What did Trump do? He just made it a whole show about them, how stupid they were, how he'd never met them. It was a spectacle. And then the country would move on and people just wouldn't pay any attention. I mean, we were talking about a zombie-like mob sleepwalking into autocracy. And so I drew on a lesson of history. I mean, I'm a student of history, and the founding fathers, when they wanted to get attention on the most important issue in the early days of this country, which was, hey, the country's fallen apart. We need a constitution to bind this thing together. It was a pretty meaty policy issue to try to get people to focus on. What did they do? They wrote anonymous essays, and they created a public spectacle to get people to pay attention to these issues, and it worked. I knew that writing this anonymously would do that. In fact, I tried to use the same pseudonym that they had used for those papers, Publius, and the Times came back to me and said, we don't do pseudonyms. We'll just have to do anonymous. But because I wanted the discerning reader to understand, my intent here isn't to hide. My intent is to focus on the message and not the messenger. And then I later, said, look, I'll come forward before 2020 in my own name because I think that's important. But for now, you, the American people, need to focus on how serious this is. And of course, at the time, the president, and everyone else denied it's not that bad. There's no way this is happening. No one's talking about the 25th Amendment. Okay, fast forward to, the insurrection in the Congress. Kevin McCarthy's talking about the 25th Amendment. Multiple cabinet members are talking about the 25th Amendment. This is real. Everything I had written in that opinion piece about the instability inside the Trump administration could have been written by half of the president's cabinet at the time. And eventually, almost half of that cabinet would come to say those things publicly. And in some cases, I felt like too late. But I also knew, Glenn, that in choosing that path and creating that spectacle to get people to focus on how serious the damage was inside the executive branch of our government, it would have enormous personal consequences for me. I had no illusions that somehow I was going to ride out of this thing, some scot-free resistance hero, and life would be grand. We'd all seen how vindictive Donald Trump was, and I knew in submitting that opinion piece, somehow, somewhere, eventually, this is going to totally detonate my life.
But it was basically a PR decision for the right reasons to focus on the issue and on nothing else, and not give him the opportunity to say, Miles who? Never met him, So how did you go from the column to the book, A Warning?
So I left the administration. There were, even in that short period between the two, a lot of really bad things that happened. But towards the end of my time there, we were at the border with the president, and he wanted to do something unlawful. He wanted to immediately seal the border and forcibly repel any migrants that were coming in. And look, the border is not secure in the United States.
And I don't want to interrupt you, but like the way you say so easily, and I receive the information so easily that the president wanted to do something unlawful, right? And here we are now, all these years later, where he's losing in court 96% of the time, according to a Stanford political science professor who analyzed all rulings, not just cases, wins and losses, across all of the Trump-related litigation. He's losing 96% of the time because, in my opinion, he is doing unlawful and unconstitutional shit 96% of the time, which, again, it's hard to believe. And so I didn't mean to interrupt you, but we are now at a place where it's just like, well, he wanted to do something unlawful. And this is the world in which we're living. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt the flow.
I got a lot of grief, some of it well-deserved, for making that decision to go into that administration, thinking we could stabilize it. However, I will say a lot of those decisions that are being made now in the second term, those were decisions that people like us prevented the president from making in the first term. Things that have now been determined to be unlawful or unconstitutional by the courts, we prevented them from ever even coming out of the president's mouth. And this was one of those. We were at the border. He wanted to seal it. He wanted to forcibly repel migrants, even the ones that had a lawful claim to asylum, which is something you just can't do under U.S. law. And we said, Mr. President, that would be illegal for us to do. Maybe the millionth time we told him that. And his response, almost verbatim, was, don't worry, if you go to jail, I'll pardon you. And I remember it that vividly because in the minutes afterwards, I went back, I composed an email, I drafted it to lawyers inside the administration and said, I need to make you aware that the president said this. I don't know if him even saying that is an act of corruption or illegal, but he basically just offered us get out of jail free passes for breaking the law to enforce a certain immigration policy. And after that, I decided, okay, now's the moment. There's no more good that can be done here. And I need to go talk about in more detail who this guy is. I wrote a much longer explication of what I felt was the danger of reelecting Donald Trump. I was worried if he won reelection, it would be a revenge machine. He would use the government for his own personal purposes. And I needed to describe that to people in detail. I used the anonymous moniker again. I knew people would pay attention to it. And I said, look, shortly after publishing this, I'm going to come forward in my own name and talk about it. And, I felt like that was very important to happen in an election year. And so the focus in 2020 for me was getting those stories out there and telling the people what would happen if he won a second term.
So you made the decision to announce you were anonymous. Boy, I hate to move on to the next chapter because I know where we're going, but what is it that has now happened to you? What has Donald Trump done or tried to do to you as a result of, you apparently becoming one of his avowed enemies because you outed some of what he had been doing in his first term?
Yeah, look, after I unmasked myself, I spent a lot of time going into detail of the things that when you're wearing a mask, you can't share with specificity, right? Because otherwise they're going to find you out before you're ready to come forward with it. And Donald Trump was infuriated by the whole thing because there's nothing that infuriates him more than the truth. And what me and many others at that point were saying about him was the truth about who Donald Trump was behind the scenes and what he intended in a second term. His response to that, after 4 years out of office and winning re-election, was on April 9th of this year, he signed an executive order. Up until that point, there had been a number of revenge orders issued by the president, not just against law firms or universities or people whose security clearances he pulled back, but none had opened federal investigations into the targets. In fact, I'm told by legal scholars that never in American history has an American president used an executive order to open an investigation into a critic, especially for First Amendment protected speech. And that's what that was. So on April 9th, I'm coming home from taking the dog to the groomers. My wife is driving home with the baby. We meet in the driveway at the same time. Beautiful sunny day, perfect day. And we're both just hopping out of the car, kind of smiling and saying, what a great day today is. And I get a message and someone says, you need to turn on the TV. The president's talking about you in the Oval Office. And I caught just enough of it to realize this isn't some security clearance revocation, which they did. This isn't just some name and shame exercise. He's ordering an investigation into me, accused me of being a spy, and announced in the signing of this order, essentially, what he believed my conviction should be. Not that he had evidence or predicate of a crime that needed to be investigated, but instead that he believed I was guilty of treason, the highest crime in the United States, a crime punishable by death. And then with the order, directed his administration, by the way, go find the evidence that he's guilty of the thing that I just said. And we've been grappling with the results ever since.
Yeah, Alice in Wonderland, right?
That's right.
Sentence first, trial later. So what has this done to your life, to your family, to your friends? Because as if that's not bad enough, and it does make my blood boil as a former career prosecutor, that a president would announce or direct a criminal investigation where, as far as anybody knows, there's no adequate predication to open a criminal investigation. That is a fancy term that lawyers use for enough evidence, some evidence that a crime has been committed and a particular person committed it. It's such a gross abuse of presidential power that, again, it's hard to absorb because it's like our institutions of government, the Department of Justice, turned on their head. And yet there's some indication, we were talking before we started recording, that maybe the Department of Justice is up and running and doing precisely what the president has directed them to do.
Yeah, I mean, we have reason to believe that at least DHS has started a probe. And, you know, in Chris Krebs' case, they were able to get confirmation that the
Because the executive order was for both of you and Chris Krebs.
Yeah.
And who is Chris Krebs?
Two separate orders. He was a colleague of mine. We worked together at the Department of Homeland Security. He oversaw election security for the federal government. And in the aftermath of the 2020 election, as Donald Trump was trying to claim the election was stolen, his hand-appointed head of election security, Chris Krebs, came out publicly and said, no, this is the most secure election in modern history. I would know. I'm in charge of the elections. And the president fired him by tweet. And both of us, he's clearly held on to these grudges for a very long time. And, you know, after our orders were issued, White House officials went to the press and said this was meant to send a message and to set an example. That example is to discourage people from speaking out, to make people afraid inside the administration and beyond. You cross the president, you say who he is, we will destroy your life. And that has, in a lot of ways, happened. I mean, we struggled, me and my wife, how much to talk about this after the fact. And for many weeks after the order, we said nothing publicly because you get a lot of well-meaning people who come to you and say, look, I know you've spoken out against Donald Trump, but this is real shit now. And if you just lay low, it will be okay. And I'll be honest with you, there was a period of time where I bought that thesis. I mean, I had hardly done anything publicly in the year leading up to this executive order. That didn't do any good. That didn't stop Donald Trump from coming and exacting revenge. And as me and my wife talked about how do we want to handle this, we realized that, you know, if we just stay quiet and hope this order blows over, we are sending a horrible message for when he does this to the third person and the fifth person and the 50th person, that the best approach is just to let something so patently unconstitutional happen to you and say nothing and hope it goes away. And so we decided to fight back. We decided to take action legally. But before that, the consequences have been enormous. I was forced to leave my job because it wasn't viable to do the consulting work I was doing while on the president's blacklist. My wife is a stay-at-home mother to our baby, and she was forced for a period of time here to go back to work because we were in a cash crunch. We have to buy bottles and formula and diapers and pay our mortgage. And, you know, we had to launch a legal defense fund. We had, you know, security threats immediately from people who, even if Donald Trump doesn't take the accusation of treason seriously, his supporters do. Yeah. His supporters treat you like you have done something deserving of death. And we received those death threats. We've lost friends, and the administration went beyond, our family and started to take punitive action. A friend of mine who was at our wedding was fired and publicly humiliated because the Trump administration found a photo of him at our wedding, and the White House fired him. He was a trade official. at the Department of Homeland Security. And then to make it worse, they planted the story in the Washington Post to say, here is what will happen to you if you associate with someone who criticizes the president. And that's before anything has happened. No one's raided our home yet. Charges haven't been brought yet. And it's been catastrophic to our lives. I don't say that for people to play the violin for me. I say it to show how much power the president wields with his pen if he wants to destroy someone's life. That is not what we ever imagined the office of the president was supposed to be able to do.
And in case anybody wondered just how dramatically Donald Trump could abuse the power of the presidency, make sure I have this straight. The White House got a picture of somebody who attended your wedding, who was working in the administration, and Donald Trump had him fired.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Somewhere along the line, you wrote a second book, Blowback, a warning to save democracy from Trump's revenge. What was the central theme of that book?
Well, look, I was worried, honestly, that people were going to have short memories. And that's also, for anyone who studies evolutionary biology, it's a truism of our brains, is that we tend to forget bad information from the past and remember good information. That's why nostalgia tends to be rose-colored. That's why you look back at your youth, even if you grew up with a alcoholic, abusive parent, you still tend to look back at good things and feel nostalgia about the past. I was really worried that 4 years of Trump being out of office would make people inclined to vote for him again. And I wanted to write, in as lucid of detail as possible, a roadmap of what Donald Trump would do if he won a second term. Here are all of the ways, effectively department by department, he will try to weaponize the federal government for his own personal gain and disassemble the guardrails of democracy. I felt like people needed to hear that. And maybe they heard it, but they didn't heed it because, of course, we wound up with him again. And no one likes the guy who says, I told you so. And I'm not Nostradamus. I think a lot of the things that I forecasted in there, almost all of them have come to fruition already in the first few months of the administration, but I think they were very foreseeable. But now there's no point in saying I told you so. The point is to say to people, if you think this is bad, it can get so much worse, and we need to really be focused on drawing that line. And, so I'm now trying to, explain to people how some of these early orders could be extrapolated out to vastly greater danger to democracy. I mean, just my case alone. The president alleges, I've shared classified information. Well, I'm going to tell you something. Criticizing a president is not classified. All right. And I know my national security obligations. Guys like you and I are in government. You pretty much know if you accidentally walk out of the building with sensitive access information that's top secret, you don't do it.
Unless you're Donald Trump.
Which is ironic that the order came from him because he had stacks of highly classified information in his house. Guys like you and I would be in prison for that. So I strongly suspect right now he's got people trying to figure out, damn, did anything Miles ever say or do? No, it wasn't classified because I was criticizing Donald Trump's character. And as much as he doesn't want people out there talking about who he is, again, that's not classified. But the mere act of him painting someone who's dissenting as a national security threat and having them investigated isn't something that stops with me. It's something they can take into all other walks of life in the United States. And I'll give you an example of how it's already happened. In the wake of the orders against me and Chris Krebs, the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, used those orders as justification to roll back longstanding protections of journalists, protections that prevent the government from going and getting warrants to search journalists' phones and devices to find out who their sources are. She cites in that order what Donald Trump said about me and Chris Krebs. So they're using it already as justification to roll back First Amendment protections for journalists. And there's nothing stopping the president at this point, until a court rules that these orders are what they are, unconstitutional, stopping him from doing this to other Americans, whether it's CEOs of businesses they could threaten, to labor leaders, to people who are protesting against military deployments in the streets. That has an enormously chilling effect. And I can tell you, Glenn, it already has. We've seen that chilling effect in terms of how we're engaging the world and other people who are afraid to even talk to us because of that order.
Have you or Chris Krebs brought any kind of a legal challenge at this point?
Well, so the other week we took a first step. My attorneys did for in response to our order, which was we requested that the inspectors general of the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security open an investigation into the Trump administration to see if the implementation of these orders involves real-time violations of our constitutional rights. We strongly suspect it does. They're unlawful, punitive, retributive orders for First Amendment protected free speech. And so we suspect that any action being done right now by any official in the administration to execute those orders involves inherently violations of constitutional rights. And in normal times, Glenn, those inspectors general would be expected to take those first steps to shine a light to see if that is indeed the case, or if the orders are just press releases that no one's acting upon. I don't know if those inspectors general will take up the case, but we're hoping to test whether this guardrail of democracy still functions. And if it doesn't, we have other legal steps that we might take.
Okay, Miles, you said that you are a lifelong conservative. Are you presently a Republican?
I'm not, no.
Okay. A Democrat or no affiliation?
I'm an independent.
Okay. So let me ask you this. You mentioned early on something that I said gave me a sense of nostalgia. Leaders working across the aisle.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any hope for the future of political parties working across the aisle? That's the first question. Then I want to ask you something about your perception of today's Republican Party.
I'm going to answer with a story, which is earlier when we talked about how I first came to Washington, I mentioned I had the best desk in Washington, D.C. This page desk where these 16-year-old messengers sit is in the back corner of the House chamber. And that perch is unlike any in the world. You get to see members of Congress, down there speaking in the well about the issues of the day. And then you get to be there in the back of the chamber when they're standing there, cutting deals, having conversations, coming to accord, building relationships. Fast forward January 6th, 2021. Like a lot of folks, I was watching live as the insurrection played out at the U.S. Capitol. And I actually had just been on Capitol Hill and saw people starting to break into the Capitol. I'd lived over that direction. I got to my car and I was driving away. I had an appointment. Actually had a group of ex-intelligence officials who were doing a sweep of my car because at that point I'd unmasked myself. We had stalkers and some stalker kept figuring out my location. And so they thought maybe they had planted something on my car. So I'm driving out to the Langley area to go have my car swept for bugs. And I'm watching the insurrection happen on my phone on CNN. And there was an image that came out in the course of that afternoon that I will never forget. And people remember the image of plainclothes Capitol police officers in suits with their guns drawn at the House chamber as the insurrectionists were trying to come in the doors. What very few people noticed was a detail that I saw in that photo. It wasn't the guys with the guns. It wasn't the people breaking the glass. The thing barricading the door was the page desk. They had gone to the corner of the chamber and pushed the desk in front of the door to the House chamber, and the only thing standing between those people and the citadel of democracy was this desk that had been, for me, symbolic of this inspiring thing politics could be, and now was the last line of defense when the barbarians were at the gate. So you talk, Glenn, about people working across the aisle. I honestly think the last time I saw people work across the aisle was just to move that desk in front of that door. That's not what collaboration should look like in our democracy. Am I hopeful? I'm not hopeful that we'll return to that. I'm not fully fatalistic about it, but I think we still apparently require an extraordinary reckoning to realize the level of changes that are needed in our politics. And the Republican Party, I think the only way it gets fixed is if it eats itself alive from within. And right now, I don't see hardly any dissent. There was some dissent in the first Trump administration, quiet dissent. There were underlings like me all the way to cabinet members, who at various fits and starts felt like, hey, we can and should still sound the alarm. I now think that dissent has been heavily, heavily suppressed. Those so-called, conservatives of conscience have been ostracized from the party. They've either been fired from jobs, scared away, or people who still have a conscience are self-censoring. And so in the near term, I have very little optimism that the Republican Party will reform. But I think if it does not, it could indeed be fatal to our democracy. And I think we are so close into the issues right now, it's tough to say whether we've passed that sort of point of political singularity where the cacophony overtakes, the democratic values, and we turn into sort of a populist mob of a country. I don't know if that has happened yet, and I think we'll need the distance of history to know. But at this moment, I still think we can potentially walk back from the brink. But like I said, it probably requires a real reckoning for people.
Okay, last question. How can there only be two? How can there only be two Republicans, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who were willing to stand up for democracy, even if it meant them losing their own job, their own title, their own position? How can there only be two?
I put this question to Adam once. We were down in South Carolina after the end of the Trump administration. We were having a conversation, and one that you and I and many others have been in many times. How is this possible? We all know so many Republicans who in private feel this way. At least at that point in time, Adam and I had a lot of friends that were members of Congress who still felt very concerned, to say the least, about Donald Trump, but very convicted that the man was ruining our democracy, and yet they weren't saying anything. And I said to Adam, I think it's because they've seen what's happened to guys like you and I, Adam, and they've seen our families get threatened, and they don't want their families threatened. And he said, no, I think it's worse than that. And I said, worse than that? I mean, what could be worse than your, wife or daughter receiving death threats? And he said, I think they are more afraid of being kicked out of the tribe than they are of death. And I said, how could that possibly be? And I thought about it for a while. And that Adam saying those words, they're more afraid of being kicked out of the tribe than death, stuck with me. And it actually made me think of this famous Jerry Seinfeld bit. He used to open up his sets by saying, a survey came out of Americans' top 10 biggest fears, and their number one biggest fear is public speaking. And their number two biggest fear is death. And so he says, your average American would rather be in the casket at a funeral than delivering the eulogy. And it's a great bit. And I think it also speaks to what Adam was saying, is people are so scared to speak out. They're so scared of the potential of saying and doing something wrong and being ostracized that they would rather die than be caught standing up. And I think that phenomenon hasn't just taken a grip on the Republican Party. I worry it's taking a grip on the country. And the only way to counteract it, if cowardice is contagious, the only way to counteract it is with courage. When people go speak up, one and then two and then three, there is strength in numbers. And that's the way we start to turn the tide. And it does begin with individual Americans.
Okay, great place to stop. But let me ask you, where can people find you? How can people support you?
Yeah, I'm writing on Substack, a lot of it about our case and our situation. I'm at treason.substack.com. I've chosen those words because if Donald Trump thinks telling the truth is treasonous, then I hope that they build bigger prisons, and then I hope more people embrace the moniker of traitor. So I'm on there on Substack. Our legal defense has been largely crowdsourced by people, and the Substack helps us support it. But if people want to contribute directly, it's endpresidentialrevenge.org. A great nonprofit whistleblower aid has started that. It's tax deductible. It goes to them, and they help pay for the legal defense of people who are fighting back against presidential revenge.
And we'll put all of that information in the description for this video. And I appreciate you being willing to talk about all this. And it's no small potatoes, obviously, what you're going through. We wish you the best. I appreciate you coming here, and would love to do a follow-up chat with you sometime soon.
Great. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Miles.
I appreciate you.
Okay.